Hey everyone, I'm Matt. By day, I'm a pretty harmless high school teacher at an arts and tech school. But every chance I get, I sling on my trusty laptop and get to work building my dream game, Willard. It's an open-world, adventure-driven platformer with a twist, because the only thing hindering your ability to explore a vast world is the fact that every day, after 8, a portal opens, and strange technologies, infused with AI but muddled and feral, emerge irately to savage the land you love. They pillage villages and suck dry the soul of the land. But these monsters seem to be looking for something. And in this disenchanted, post-enlightenment, post-apocalypse, there's no magic to save you. And yet, as you encounter other survivors, you notice that they all seem to be looking for something. And so you, Willard, the non-magical son of a murdered wizard, find yourself looking for something. As your journey begins, a voice calls to you, a whisper, telling you to search out the mountaintop because for some inexplicable reason, no one else will. You'll need help. You can't save the world in your skivvies, so through roguelike exploration and the generosity of others, you'll find and equip new gear. You'll help those other survivors build a refuge against the enemies and you'll defend it together. Part roguelike exploration, part city-building tower defense, and part loot-based RPG, Willard will take you on an adventure that explores themes of artificial intelligence, losing faith, exploring the unknown, and searching for enchantment in a disenchanted world. I've been working on Willard for 2.5 years, and this devlog marks 4 months since I started a complete rebuild of the game. So far, I built a player controller, started creating a world for the player to live in, and I've added my first enemies and combat system. But Willard is so much more than just a platformer with combat. In the last few weeks, I've been adding buildings, NPCs, and creating a system to give those NPCs homes, as well as to store supplies in the buildings. I'm quickly moving toward my first playable mini demo, and I want to show off what's been happening since last time. First of all, combat is hard. I'm not going to get anything that feels like Hades, Hollow Knight, or Rogue Legacy overnight, so I've decided to just dedicate a little time to combat each month. This month, I added my first weapon, the rusty sword. I started work on the animations and came up with frames for 3 different attacks. These looked great on paper, but when I put them into Unity, they lacked any sense of weight. It was a little hard to tell just what was happening when I was swinging that sword around. To help me get this feeling right, I took some footage of me swinging a sword, actually it's a rolled up Hobbit poster, around in my classroom. I'm no master swordsman, but this footage was incredibly helpful, as it allowed me to slow down the action frame by frame and really look at what my body's doing during an attack. This also helped me to realize that every sword stroke is supposed to tell a story. It needs anticipation, a climax, and then a denouement. Most of the story is actually spent in building anticipation and in lingering in the resolution. The smear, or climax, is actually just a very short part of the whole thing. This new version isn't perfect, but it actually feels like the sword has some weight to it now, and the attacks are starting to tell a story. I also added in some swooshes to make it feel a little more dramatic. Adding these to the animations definitely helps to define the attacks more. While I was working on combat, I realized that I needed to add separate jumping attacks. I began with the sword strike and decided to act this one out first. Again, I'm not totally happy with the animation, but it's a good first draft. Next, I added an airborne punch animation. Nobody wants to see me act this one out. And besides that, a big part of my visual aesthetic is about evoking a little bit of nostalgia for the games of the past. So I used Street Fighter II as an inspiration here. Now, an important part of combat and just playing Willard in general will be collecting different gear. And I want this to change the way the player looks. I now understand why most games don't do this. Willard has roughly 40 different animations, and each one has 4 to 8 different frames. Currently, this puts me at about 160 unique frames that I have to draw for each piece of gear I add into the game. Yeah, this sounds insane, but I am committed to the idea. One of the great things about not having a publisher is that if I decide this game's gonna take 10 years, I can take 10 years to make it if I want. So, I've been working on adding some pants. Here you can see what it looks like so far. With a little combat maintenance complete, it was time to focus on this month's objectives, adding some buildings to the world. Buildings are actually what got me started with pixel art. All my life I wanted to make beautiful art, but it just didn't come naturally to me. When I first got the idea that would eventually develop into Willard, I knew I was going to need to make buildings, and somehow these didn't seem so intimidating as buildings are mostly made of simple geometric shapes. And so I approach my building design probably more like a builder than an artist, I guess you could say. I create the raw materials first: wood, planks, logs, platforms, spikes, and ladders, and then assemble the building piece by piece. With my first cabin, I started with a rough shape and then just kept adding details until it looked right. To give it more life, I created a door animation, added some lighting. Here you can see that the light casts shadows on the player when the door's opened and then stops when it's closed. With the cabin complete, I created a series of frames for different damage states. This was especially easy to do since I'd already made up all the raw materials and could just grab them and put them down on the ground without needing to do much extra drawing. Here's a little test I did, where I can deal damage to the house with a button press, and you can see it deteriorating as it takes damage. Next, I made the house a viable target for enemies. For now, they just prioritize whatever's closest to them. Now that I had the visuals in place, it was time to hook this all up and make it function like a game. The game will need to know who lives in the houses, what supplies are stored there, and what the current health of the building is at. Additionally, the player has other stats that will also need to be visible at different times in the game, things like restedness and hunger bars. This meant that I would have to take a foray into the dreaded world of UI design. Now, none of what you see here is final, it's just what I came up with in the moment, but I got right to work. First, I added 2 simple bars to the player that can be toggled with a click. Next, I wanted the player to be able to access data about the buildings in the village. I made it so you can select a building by clicking on it, or by pressing the interact button while standing over one. First, this just meant a little stretch animation and an outline of the selected building. But then I added in a menu to display building data, and I made it so you can collect NPCs and have them appear inside of the building. It's not perfect, but you get the idea. Now, there will be more than one house in your village, so I created some player cards for when an NPC joins you. Now you can select their card, go up to a house, and set it as the NPC's home. This worked, but needed some optimization. It felt kind of clunky. So I iterated. I added some more instructions. Then I paused the game during placement. Finally, I added some camera zooming and the ability to scroll between buildings. With that done, I wanted the player to be able to store supplies in the building, so I created some UI first, then made it so you could open up that UI by clicking on the door of a building. I also hooked this up to the player's inventory so that your resources would actually appear in the left menu. Finally, I set it up so you can click to store them inside the building itself. At this point, I was super done with UI, but I was ready to test the start of a play loop. In theory, I can collect and store items, I can spawn in enemies, and I can defend my buildings. I added a little portal that can spawn in the enemies and hooked it up to my world time script, which allows me to pick a specific time of day when the portal will open up. With that, I decided to give it a whirl, and it broke fantastically. I mean, seriously, look at this guy. Okay, so I fixed the spawning. Apparently I was spawning him in several meters in the background, so my perspective camera rendered him as itty-bitty. And, well, now the loop works. Admittedly, there's not a whole lot going on here, but it's starting to play like a game. Next up, I want to keep iterating on combat. I want to add the ability to repair buildings, harvest resources, and I want to get Willard better clothed. All of that's coming up in the next video. Hope to see you there, but until that time, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.